Let's get hyped for Ordinals and Bitcoin! All right, yeah. Well, yeah, that's the whole presentation. That's pretty much everything you all need to know. No, I'm just kidding. Welcome one, welcome all to the April edition of the Orange Server Bitcoin Meetup. My real name is Charlie, but I go by Stubs here on this server. And my partner in crime, Cypher, is putting some last-minute touches on our base. Cypher is like 10 times smarter than me. So whenever I have questions, I go to him. We're longtime Bitcoiners. We both work in Bitcoin, building around it, educating it. We both run a Bitcoin-only meetup here in North America, in Oklahoma. And we love just educating people about how Bitcoin works. But a few months ago, we found ourselves, as a side project, kind of interested in this new thing going on, this new idea called ordinal theory. And that's kind of taken over our lives, a side project which has become the majority of our focus. And it's a little bit controversial, but I think I will only emphasize the positive, really cool things about it. And it's also a little bit difficult to explain, especially if you don't know much about Bitcoin itself. But I think I can be kind of simple and straightforward about it. Yeah, so go ahead and hit the next slide, Mad. So, clap if you know what this is. This is the Bitcoin Genesis block. When Satoshi Nakamoto launched the Bitcoin blockchain in 2009, Satoshi mined the first Bitcoin block. And this is kind of what it looks like. And it was really cool because we saw the creation of the hardest, strongest, most immutable monetary system we've ever seen. And this block was kind of a shot across the bow to the traditional banking system and centralized powers like governments. And it contains a lot in it. So it looks like a lot of code, but if you see over here on the right side, you see Satoshi actually embedded a message in this block. And it's a clip from the headline of a newspaper at the time, which really describes what the whole purpose of Bitcoin is. And the headline says, "Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks." And it's basically Satoshi, with that message and the launch of Bitcoin, described why Bitcoin exists, and also demonstrated that you can use Bitcoin to broadcast the things you want to communicate to the world, and nobody can stop it. That message there is in the Bitcoin blockchain, and if you run a Bitcoin full node, you have this message. And so that kind of is the lens through which we view what happens next. So, next slide, please. We know that Bitcoin is the best clock. So what a blockchain is really is it's a timekeeping mechanism. It orders events. It said this happened before this happened before this. And through that clock timekeeping mechanism, we find that Bitcoin becomes the best money. So those are two of the core purposes and things that Bitcoin is. But are there other things that Bitcoin is the best at? And it seems like, oh, Bitcoin's, it's like $30,000. A lot of people will never be able to afford a whole Bitcoin. But we don't look at the price. We only look at the fundamentals. Bitcoin's only been around for 13, 14 years. This is still very early in the story. There's a lot to be discovered about how Bitcoin can be used and what's going to be built on it. So go to the next slide, please. This is a famous photo from a famous video of an event that took place in the 80s in China, in Tiananmen Square, where the Chinese government, one of the most powerful governments in the world, massacred many of their own civilians. And the Chinese government wishes to censor and prevent this photo and the knowledge of this event from being distributed across their citizens. This photo, 2 months ago, was put onto the Bitcoin blockchain and distribute across thousands of nodes across the world, a ton of which exist inside the Chinese state. I'll go back once. Actually, this is good. That's all we can say here. How did this image of Tiananmen Square get onto the Bitcoin blockchain? So we won't go into how a transaction works really, but basically you send some information, you sign a transaction, and the network sees it, and that goes onto the Bitcoin blockchain. It'll eventually get included, and your transaction will go through. But what you can do is you can also include some data with that transaction. And recently, so people have been doing this kind of data for a long time, but recently we've seen a lot of people put actual like images and different types of data, like this picture of Tiananmen Square, in their transaction. So when that transaction gets included onto the Bitcoin blockchain, however many sats, maybe it's one sat, maybe it's one whole Bitcoin that gets added to the blockchain, this data does too. And so that's how that image gets appended to the Bitcoin blockchain. So at next slide. So we can see this kind of line of blocks, pretty cool. And we see this picture of Tiananmen Square gets added to this block. And then that is immortalized and copied onto everyone's node who runs the node and validates the Bitcoin. So what the are ordinals? I haven't even talked about that yet. Or what is ordinal theory? Going to use the analogy of chairs. Next slide. Okay, so let's say we're all in this room, right? This is great. You're all sitting on chairs. And all these chairs, let's just pretend they don't have skins on them. They all look alike. They all work the same. They all function the same. We don't really differentiate between them. I don't care if I'm sitting in Deviate Potato's chair or Desktop Commando's chair. They're a chair just the same. But let's imagine that we just put numbers on them. And so they're the same chairs. But if we all agree that this chair over on the left is number 1 and this chair over on the right is number 5, if I say, Desktop Commando, go sit in chair number 4, he'll go sit in chair number 4. And if I say Deviant Potato, go sit in chair number 2, he'll go sit in chair number 2. They're the same chairs. And if somebody were to walk in and they didn't see the numbers, they wouldn't notice that, and they'd be able to sit in the chairs, and the chairs would work just fine. Next slide. So what if these chairs were Bitcoin? This is how ordinal theory works. All the Bitcoin's the same. We don't care who owns which Bitcoin. But if we start numbering them, we can start tracking this. I have Bitcoin number 1. You could have never heard or known that other people are numbering these Bitcoin. But if you and I communicate a numbering system, then we can start differentiating between them. It doesn't affect how Bitcoin works, but it's kind of our own consensus layer on top of it. So what we actually do is, instead of the whole Bitcoins, we actually take the smallest unit of a Bitcoin currently, the sats, the Satoshi, that's the symbol for Satoshi, and each one of those is numbered. And ordinal theory is a way of numbering Satoshis, like this, where the individual Satoshi we're calling an ordinal. And because there's only 21 million Bitcoin, that means there will only be 21 million times 100 million Satoshis per Bitcoin. That is 2.1 quadrillion ordinals. And so let's say we start, whenever we send a transaction and that image of Tiananmen Square, or as I did early on, an image of the Orange server blood bank promotional, when I send a transaction and we ascribe to ordinal theory, we can associate this picture with that Satoshi and that picture with that Satoshi. Everybody has a copy of them on their own node, but we can pretend that, oh, well, I'll have kind of like the ownership of that piece of data. Now, everyone has it, but only one person owns this specific Satoshi numbered 1. Next slide. It's important to emphasize that this is something that goes on top of Bitcoin. It is opt-in. It's not in the Bitcoin core code. You don't ever have to even know it exists. But if some people in their own little weird corner of Discord are using it, they can start doing fun things, or like say tracking the data that they put onto Bitcoin. This gets into one of the core ideas of what Bitcoin, how it works, and that's called voluntarism down here. That we don't ever force anybody to do anything. Everyone voluntarily opts into this network. That's why Bitcoin's so popular, because even though it's voluntary, people still view it as very compelling to use because it helps them do things they can't do otherwise. Ordinal theory is also opt-in. So you can use Bitcoin and you can not opt into ordinal theory, or if you think it's cool and fun or very powerful, you can opt into it. Next slide. So here we have all the Bitcoin nodes running on computers around the world. Everybody's using Bitcoin. It works as normal. And then we go to the next slide. Let's say some of the people start running ordinal theory, that O, and then some of the people just either don't know about it, or they don't like it, or they don't want to do it. Bitcoin still works as intended. It still works. You can do all the normal Bitcoin things with it. But some people will choose to start numbering the Satoshis according to ordinal theory. Next slide. And what we've seen is the past 3 months is because it's so fun or so interesting or so compelling to start doing this, we've seen the number of people who are running the Bitcoin nodes increased by a significant amount, the most I've ever seen it in a 2-month period. And one thing that we know is we don't care about the price of Bitcoin in dollars. The most important thing we care about are number go up of nodes, of mining, of hash rate, of people using Bitcoin. This is what strengthens the Bitcoin network, and this is what makes it super powerful. You may have heard that this is like this enables NFTs on Bitcoin, or people saying like, oh, this is like graffiti on Bitcoin. And there are some good criticisms of this. We've seen people put like bad things on Bitcoin, and it can kind of bring some bad branding to it. But some people get interested in some of these, in buying and trading and collecting these images. We certainly saw it be really popular the past couple of years. I've never been super into it, but if it brings more people to Bitcoin, then I think that's generally a good thing. But what's more important than this is that we actually see that the nature of what we call an NFT, which I've got mixed feelings about, is actually changing. Because with an NFT on other blockchains, you don't actually own your data. That data exists on some third-party server somewhere. That data can be changed by whoever wrote the contract. But if you do this on Bitcoin, if you put your image of something on Bitcoin, like, say, Tiananmen Square or the Orange Blood Bank server promotional picture, you actually have put the actual data on Bitcoin. Nobody can change that. Nobody can rug you by changing the licensing of your Bored Ape. Nobody can actually upgrade the contract of your CryptoPunk. Nobody can make you erase that man standing in front of the tank at Tiananmen Square. Next slide. The most important thing about this is that nobody can tell you what you can and can't do with Bitcoin. You can own it. You can trade it with whoever wants to. No government can censor it. They can try. They can make it hard to use, but they can't stop it. That's why this is one of the coolest things about Bitcoin, is that it's so early, and we thought, a lot of people said, oh, you can't put this stuff on Bitcoin a couple years ago, but now you can. And this makes me kind of ask generally, what else can Bitcoin do that people say it can't? People say you can stop Bitcoin. I don't think you can. People have tried for the past decade and they haven't been able to. Next slide. Bitcoin is the best clock. It's the best money. Could it also be the best uncensorable information? I think this is really cool because it unlocks new use cases for Bitcoin that even a lot of longtime Bitcoiners hadn't thought of. If you want to announce something to the world, you could put it on Bitcoin. If you want to preserve information objectively, whether the media or media platforms or a government wants to censor it, you can put it on Bitcoin and they can't stop you. Last slide. Bitcoin is you money. It's you to the banks. That's what Satoshi said at the beginning in the Genesis block. It can also be you art. And it can be a lot more than that too. I think this idea of images and JPEGs on Bitcoin is just the beginning. There's a lot more going on here. And I actually don't think we'll be talking about images and JPEGs on Bitcoin in the future. I think we'll be talking about preserving information for humanity. So I think this is one of the coolest things. Bitcoin is for the hardcore anarcho-capitalist, it's for the artist, it's for the creative, it's for the gamer. So this is the whole point of Bitcoin. It's for everybody, and nobody can stop each other from using it. So last slide. If you want to know more, come hang out in the Ordinals Discord. Go to ordinals.com. I strongly recommend reading anything that the inventor of this idea, Casey Rodarmor, has written. Rodarmor.com is his blog, and then he's got a podcast called the Hell Money Podcast. It's really good. Yeah, so thank you all for listening. I would love to take questions, but I know that it can be hard to ask questions about this topic. So yeah, thank you all. Yeah, go ahead, Boo Boo, ask a question. Any question. Yes, you can put files. So actually, this is one of my favorite things. So we're all gamers here, right? Yeah, you can put images on into Bitcoin, but you can actually put whole games. And what we call doing this, we call putting these files on, we call them inscriptions. We don't call them NFTs. So what we've seen is people actually have put, you remember the old school game Doom, like that shooter game? Somebody's put that whole thing on Bitcoin. People put the game Snake on Bitcoin. There's an interesting thing like those text adventures. People have put them on Bitcoin. And so those might seem really fun, but I mean, imagine like what this looks like over the next couple of years as people put more complex, cool things on Bitcoin. What's up, Fodal? Question.
First of all, are there any downsides to Ordinals?
Depends on who you ask. So, yeah, I'll give a good devil's advocate. So, the Ordinal, this is data that goes on chain, and one of the arguments is that running a Bitcoin node should be really easy and accessible to everyone, and adding more data means it can be a little bit heavier and harder to run that node. Additionally, certain transactions, which are financial transactions, like me sending you, say, 100 Bitcoin, that's a pretty important transaction. But sometimes, if somebody's trying to send, say, their JPEG, and that gets processed before our important financial transaction, that could be a bad thing. I think long term that the pricing of how transactions are priced on Bitcoin will ultimately find a happy medium for this. I think it's going to be very hard to do dumb things on Bitcoin in 10 years. But right now it's it's kind of cheap to do any kind of transaction comparatively. If I can put anything I want as a transaction, is it still safe and how? Well, it depends what you mean by safe. So if you put it onto Bitcoin, if you inscribe it is the term here. Everybody can see it. So everybody will have a copy of it. And so you've got to know that it's kind of like sending a Bitcoin transaction where everybody can see that transaction. And so if you inscribe something using Ordinal theory onto Bitcoin, yeah, you can put a keylogger into a transaction. This opens up a ton of vulnerabilities for the user. You can put all that stuff in. So it's really important that if you are browsing the Bitcoin blockchain and reading this data, that you have it either properly sandboxed or the proper safeguards in place. This is so early, and we've seen some people, yeah, you can upload HTML files, as Desktop Commando said. It's really, really cool. You can do like dynamic HTML. This is there's a lot of, it's very early. You know, the majority of Bitcoin's early use in the first couple years were like, you might have heard of the Silk Road. You may have heard of Satoshi's Dice. And those are, you know, sometimes negatively viewed, but I view those as very early use cases of a new technology, which has to figure out how it's going to be applied in a very serious manner. So I think in 5 years, we'll be looking at this as a, wow, this is the early days of people doing small little fun things on Bitcoin, and the early genesis of new cool stuff on Bitcoin. Again, this doesn't affect the base layer of how Bitcoin's used. It is entirely opt-in and voluntary. A year from now, maybe nobody will be doing this. Maybe, as I said, we've numbered the chairs and numbered the Bitcoin. Maybe no one else will care to keep track of those, and that's totally fine. But this is why Bitcoin's so cool, is that this idea was come up by one person, and they wrote some code and they implemented it. And that's how one person can change how a lot of people who use their money and change a multi-billion dollar, $500 billion monetary network. And if we have more people coming up with cool ideas in their bedrooms, the better.
Is there, when you inscribe a file, is there a limit to, like, the size of the file?
Yes, that is a great question. Yeah, maybe you're throwing me softballs. So, we actually had a whole debate in Bitcoin over the amount of information that can go into a Bitcoin block a few years ago, called the block size war. And we defined the maximum size of a Bitcoin block to be about 4 megabytes, which is not very big for file size. So right now, the largest unit of information you can put, the largest file you can put in is 4 megabytes. And it's very expensive to do that. So actually this morning, today, we had a very notable, what we call 4 megabyte transaction, or as we colloquially call it, a 4 megger, be mined by a mining pool. And it was the new edition of the Bitcoin magazine cover, which featured the headshot of Julian Assange, the guy who invented and runs WikiLeaks. And so you can include up to 4 megabytes of data, but there are workarounds to this, not on the including it into a transaction, but because of some really cool, interesting, not new ideas where you have one inscription reference another inscription, which references another. It's basically, like, this is very early days. Yep, it was expensive. The going rate is very expensive, I won't say. If you're serious, you can inquire.
Sorry for all the questions, but does Ordinals, do they have a way of tracking sats? Like, does it help in people trying to track sats, like the transactions and where the sats go?
Yeah, so if I have sat 101 and I send it in a transaction to you, now you have sat 101. This works through Bitcoin's UTXO model, which I'm not gonna try to explain right now. If you and I run the same type of what are called Ordinals aware client on top of our Bitcoin node, then we both acknowledge that I sent you Satoshi number 101. And that's how it's tracked.
Oh, thanks, Stubs. Good presentation.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. I love talking about this. I'm here to talk about Bitcoin. Oh, miner incentives. Yeah, GM, that's a really good question. To answer that, I'll probably have to get a little technical. So, does it affect miner incentives? Well, we've definitely seen the amount of money that miners make go up, and it's a bear market, so miners are desperate and hungry. So miners are very welcoming of new what are called Bitcoin transaction fees, which increase when more people are trying to inscribe and stuff. But what you're talking about is in what's called an out-of-band payment, where if you want to, it's hard to like inscribe a whole 4 megabyte transaction. Like it's just technically not likely and expensive for a Bitcoin mining pool to include it into a block. So basically what we've seen is historically for some of these like 4 megabyte transactions, or these large, uncommonly large ones, someone will actually pay a Bitcoin mining pool either like they'll hand them a Bitcoin off chain, or they'll like write them a check for dollars off chain. And people are rightfully concerned that this might change the incentive model. But the short response is that Bitcoin mining pool operation is raced to zero. And so if you are able to, Bitcoin mining pools are always incentivized to pay their users more than anybody else. So if you have what I would consider like a deal flow component to pool, to like including stuff in blocks, you're going to be incentivized to pay those or pass on that revenue to miners in some way. So on the long timeline, if one pool does it, then all pools have to do it, because that one pool is out competing the others. It's kind of the same like game theory as nation state Bitcoin mining, where eventually pools will have to settle on an appropriate amount of what are called out-of-band payments to pay to miners. This is very early, and this is like kind of still very theoretical in how this might play out, but I think it's very exciting. I get personally very excited on new ideas that might change how Bitcoin works, and I like to try to see how they'll play out, and I like to be a part of solving them.
Quick question.
Yeah.
How to think about this and rephrase it? Initially, I don't know much. So, one of the things, like with yeah, if you can put up like good stuff, or you can also put up bad stuff, which even though you can't take down Bitcoin, can get a lot of like negative people.
Yeah, this is the unfortunate thing.
Yes, I'm
so
that was the question till those Poldorf who raised if you can identify partners, because Nostr solves this by you don't need to be like send people's information that you don't want. They would initially have to, eventually have to go to their own node or like that. And
yeah,
if the ordinal, like if the ordinals were like not identifiable at all, like then kind of Bitcoin would be responsible for nation states go to scary thing, child porn or whatever. But if you can identify it, then it comes different. Kind of can suss out the bad actors. Is that how it works?
I'm not 100% sure that I understood exactly what you're asking, but I think we'll find that not everything needs to go on Bitcoin. We'll find it's probably only the most important stuff that needs to be there forever. And
okay,
because anybody can put it...
Specify the question. Yeah,
sure.
Let's say that you have a Bitcoin hater starting putting child porn normals just to destroy the reputation. How can you separate, so you can like say, okay, it's these wallets or whatever who is doing it? that you can like prove that it's not like Bitcoin is not like everything bad in the world.
Yeah, so this is because you there's a few ways we can respond to this. So the way the way you view these inscriptions is through an explorer or running your own Ord server. And it's common practice, and I run a couple of these explorers, to censor this information the same way we would censor other bad information. But we can't stop it from getting included to Bitcoin. So then when somebody does put something evil like child porn on Bitcoin, and people have been doing that for years actually before Ordinals, or they putting references to it. We can identify, yeah, that's true. We can identify their IP. Now this is an attack vector, the same way it's an attack vector for sending any kind of Bitcoin transaction. So what we find is Bitcoin, you can't stop it. But if you are in the borders of a state that wants to enforce something like that, then they can use both chain analysis and IP tracking to find out who did that. This is the double-edged sword of uncensorability, is that it works for both good and evil people and everything in between. And my view is that it's better that it be uncensorable for everyone, and the benefits of something being free and open far outweigh the evil things.
Hey, can I ask a question?
This is sweet. Yeah, what's up?
Who am I talking to? Is this Stubs doing the presentation?
Yeah.
Hey, what's up, man? I caught most of it. My name is Phil. I'm Need Creations on Twitter. Big fan of what you guys are doing here with the Orange meetups. So this is freaking awesome. I'm trying to figure out how to take a screenshot so I can post to Twitter. But anyways, my question is, what are your thoughts on minting ordinals? And, if I can be frank, the whole NFT thing, you mint a bunch of NFTs and you try to sell them to someone who's not as smart as you, because they're buying something that's, in my opinion, effectively worthless. But you're trying to. So I see NFTs and selling ordinals as a scam, plain and simple. And you're if you're minting ordinals and trying to sell them, you're what you're doing is you're prying on people who, retail investors that don't really know what they're buying. They're falling for the hype. That's my opinion. And it's provably true with what's happened to NFTs. The hype has died down, and everyone that bought these things are holding the bag, right? And so now these ordinals are NFTs on Bitcoin, and it's kind of cool. You can put you can print a 3D gun and put the template on the blockchain. Yeah, that's pretty cool and important. But as far as minting monkey JPEGs and selling them to people, I'm not a big fan of that. And most recently, Bitcoin Magazine has minted an ordinals collection, and they're selling them. And I want to know your thoughts on that. Do you think that's right, or do you think or it doesn't matter? Are you neutral to that, or what are your thoughts on that?
So I think long term, things that are frivolous will be priced out of Bitcoin on the long run. On the short term, I do think it is challenging to communicate the important high points of Bitcoin, which is uncensorable money. And I think when it comes down to the value of NFTs, I strongly support people transacting how they want. I really want user education. So if somebody's buying what they would consider to be digital art, I want them to know that on other blockchains, they might not actually own that art. On Bitcoin, they own it insofar as the counterparty agrees that ordinal theory exists. And then I also want to emphasize that I think the way a lot of the really cool stuff that Bitcoin begins looks pretty trivial and frivolous at the beginning. The majority of Bitcoin's use for like 2010, 2011 was like gambling, and then the majority of Bitcoin after that, the next year or so, was for on darknet markets. And I think this is kind of like, if you're familiar with that, like how does something collectible become a unit of account graph? I think it goes through various evolutions. I think we've seen so many people who come from the NFT world who are disillusioned with that come and see that Bitcoin's virtues, and they'll try to map on a lot of the, I think, like kind of frivolous, shitty, scammy nature to it. But we're also seeing that they're all downloading full nodes. They are learning how Bitcoin's UTXO model works. They're taking a lot of the optimism that came from the NFT world, which seems to have fizzled out, and they're applying that to Bitcoin. So I think there's going to be tons of huge issues that come with this. I think there's going to be tons of shitty activity. I think long term, it's going to bring a whole new cohort of people using it, and I try to endorse dollar cost averaging, self-custody, and also user education. So I also realize that there's some things that are just not ever going to be resolved debates. It's can be ideological at times, and I always like to be on the side of bringing more people into Bitcoin, and I'll let other people probably clarify or evolve that conversation beyond just me. Yeah.
Cool, man. Thanks for the answer. I really appreciate that. Well said.
Does that mean some sets have more value than others?
Depends on the market. Some people have bought a specific Satoshi for thousands of dollars. This gets me really excited, and some people really frustrated. I think that if you have been studying how Bitcoin's UTXO model works for the past decade, just so you can be kind of a technophile and get excited about Bitcoin, this opens up this crazy market of being really good at running and sifting through Bitcoin. And it actually, like for example, Sci4, who's building the base right now, I still put him on the presentation. He's pretty much broken every conceivable open source wallet in the past 2 months, doing things that are well outside the intended use case, but yet within Bitcoin's consensus rules. And so this is like doing all these crazy things, like drive forwards, like all these edge cases for Bitcoin we never knew existed. And it's kind of bringing a renaissance for people to look critically at how pools operate, how blocks are constructed, how transactions are constructed, how Bitcoin wallets have been unbelievably inefficient in their operation and design. Even some of the best wallets are like surprisingly inefficient. And so that is like kind of the frontier of cool new shit that's being that's coming out of this this kind of movement, if you will. One of my favorite things, this is a bit of an aside, is if you have an NFT on another blockchain, there's a way to burn it, to destroy it on that blockchain and copy it onto Bitcoin, and as a bit of like penance, so you can be absolved of your shitcoinery forever. Bring that to Bitcoin and repent and start DCAing.
Hey, let's all give Stubs a round of applause for the awesome presentation. Yeah.